Welcome to the West Ohio Conference Trauma-Informed Ministry Series. I'm Rebecca Hugg, a licensed professional counselor in the state of Ohio. In this episode, we will define trauma and discuss causes, types, and effects of trauma, as well as look at how we as United Methodists can respond. But first, why is this work important? Why is knowing about trauma and how it affects our congregations and communities relevant to our ministry as faith workers? The simple reality is, trauma is often the result of harm done in our world. That harm often shows up through invisible wounds that affect people's ability to trust others, to trust themselves, and to fully embrace the love of Christ through the community of God's people. The heart of the gospel, of Jesus' work, is healing open wounds. Jesus showed us examples of reaching into the lives of the other, seeing them for the wounds and the strengths they possessed, calling them beloved children of God. Jesus created safe space for healing of bodies, minds, and spirits, and we are called to be like Jesus. As I consider the makeup of our communities in West Ohio, I'm constantly drawn to the potential invisible wounds that we as the church can help to heal. Much of my work in ministry and counseling has been with young persons. They talk about active shooter drills in their classrooms, lack of emotional care from adults in their lives, and the fears of what will be in such a global climate as the one we live in today. I think of veterans returning from deployment, forever changed by what they've seen and experienced. I think about their families who don't quite know how to build a relationship with their loved one who's changed. I think about our sisters and brothers affected by recent natural disasters, tornadoes, floods, and droughts, who are continuing the journey toward recovery and healing, not only within their communities, but within their own families and within themselves. I think about our communities affected by gun violence, poverty, neglect, abuse. And when I think about these communities, I know every single one of our West Ohio congregations has someone, a family, maybe even their entire community, who is affected by harm that has been done and the aftermath of trauma. As United Methodists, we are called to first do no harm, then to do good, and then to stay in love with God. Let's learn together how we can create safe spaces in our churches and in our communities for people to heal from their invisible wounds in and through the power of Christ. Trauma and crisis are words thrown around a lot today. We hear about trauma and crisis in the news, in the hallways of our schools, at the workplace, and in the pews of our churches. So what are crisis and trauma exactly? A crisis is an emotionally significant event or a radical change of status in a person's life. A crisis could be the loss of a job, the death of a loved one, or experiencing a natural disaster. Crises can cause extreme stress to the individual, their family and friends, and their community. When a person doesn't have the supports and the resources needed to healthfully deal with the stress of a crisis, they are at risk of experiencing traumatic stress, leading to trauma. Trauma can be defined as a real or perceived threat to one's life or livelihood, or viewing a threat to another person's life. To recap, crisis is an emotionally significant event or radical change in a person's life. And when a person does not have the support and resources needed to cope with those changes or events, they are at risk of experiencing traumatic stress, leading to trauma. Not everyone who experiences a crisis will experience trauma. Here's an important tip. Even though we've defined crisis and trauma here, it is never our place to define for someone else their experience of crisis or trauma. The experience of trauma is always defined by the individual. There may be times where the effects of a traumatic experience are so great that someone may seek additional mental health care. I've seen this a lot with veterans, communities affected by gun violence, rape victims, and more. While trauma is defined by the individual, there may be a time when a mental health or medical professional will diagnose someone with a trauma disorder, such as post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, so that that person can receive greater care. Seeking mental health services is an honorable choice and I pray you would encourage loved ones to seek additional care from professionals if they are struggling with the effects of trauma. Violence, abuse, and neglect, natural disasters, and accidents are a few examples of situations that may cause traumatic stress and lead to trauma. Violence is a universal issue, and it is a social justice issue we as United Methodists take a strong stance on. Our 2016 Book of Discipline states, "God deplores violence in our homes and streets, rebukes the world's warring madness, humbles the powerful and lifts up the lowly, and so shall we." God's desire for us, for the people who have been made in Imago Dei, God's image, is that we would seek peace, justice, and love in all that we do and in all that we are. We know that our communities and our world struggle to be a place of peace and restorative justice. Yet we have the hope through our faith that we might be for others, for our communities, and for our world, the redemptive love of Christ, providing healing in those open wounds caused by violence. The 2016 Book of Discipline and 2016 Book of Resolutions goes on to name various forms of violence and disparities that we as Christians fight against, such as domestic and gun violence, human trafficking, incarceration, the separation of migrant families, the harm of Indigenous persons, the realities of hunger and poverty, disparities in healthcare, and the stigmas around mental health. We as United Methodists care about those affected by violence and injustice, and know too well the negative effects, including trauma, that may occur as a result. So how do we better understand the effects of traumatic situations? Let's look at the different types of trauma. Trauma can take many various forms, depending on the number of traumatic situations and how the traumatic stress was caused. Acute trauma is a one-time experience of one type of traumatic stress. An example may be a family who's experienced the aftermath of a natural disaster. Chronic trauma includes one type of traumatic stress occurring multiple times over a long time period. An example may be war. Soldiers are often exposed to war-based traumatic stress over and over again during deployment. Complex trauma includes multiple forms of traumatic stress, multiple times over a long time period. An example may be a community violence situation, a constant exposure and fear of gun, sex-based, and hate-based violence due to the area that someone lives in. To recap, trauma can happen one time in one way, acute, multiple times in one way, chronic, or multiple times in multiple ways, complex. Trauma can also be developmental, generational, and systemic. Developmental trauma is chronic or complex trauma that occurs during early development. I've worked with a lot of teenagers who have experienced developmental trauma due to addiction of a parent, neglect, exploitation, and violence, to name a few. For more information on developmental trauma and how the brain is affected, check out the Trauma-Informed Ministry episode about developmental trauma. Generational trauma is passed down through the thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors of older generations to younger generations. One of the best examples is the current traumatic stress and trauma symptoms of young Jewish persons who have heard the stories of persecution from older generations. The way that young people think, what they believe, how they behave, and how they view and interpret the world is strongly impacted by the generational traumatic stress of being a Jewish descendant of someone who survived or died in a concentration camp. Generational trauma is not passed down through genetics, but rather through thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors from older generations. Systemic trauma is often linked with complex trauma, because it is the persistent and consistent marginalization, oppression, and othering of a group of people or a location. Systemic traumatic stress may cause a sort of numbness in a community where surviving, rather than thriving, is the norm. In 2016 in Columbus, Ohio, an unarmed Black male was shot multiple times and soon after died from those wounds. I interviewed Black mothers in this community asking, "How are you grieving this death?" The response I received was, "Grieving is a luxury. We have jobs and families to keep up with. Killings like this happen more than the media covers. You just hug your kids a little bit more in the morning before they leave for school and pray to God you get to see them again at night." Communities affected by systemic trauma often are hit with many types of traumatic stress, with very little relief or rest. Trauma affects a person's entire operating system. It affects a person emotionally, socially, physically, psychologically, and spiritually. Many trauma effects negatively impact a person's life. Depression, suicidal or homicidal thoughts, and skill deficits in communication, relationship development, and decision-making. If someone else or if you yourself are experiencing negative effects from traumatic stress or a traumatic incident, please seek out help from a licensed mental health worker. There are also adaptive effects. Adaptive effects may be helpful to a person for the time being as a means of survival after a traumatic incident. As time progresses, though, adaptive effects may hinder a person's ability to develop and maintain healthy relationships and may limit their ability to feel safe and fully present in the world. It's important for us as faith leaders to recognize and respond appropriately to signs of traumatic stress. Let's walk through these different adaptive trauma effects so you can better recognize them and respond. Hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is the heightened awareness of one's surroundings. Often, hypervigilance will include someone knowing where and having access to all the exits in their current location, knowing where people are in the current space and making certain folks aren't standing too close or standing behind them. Hypervigilance often results in a person being easily startled, especially by noises or being touched. The second adaptive effect is intuition. People who have experienced some types of trauma, specifically violence-based trauma, may have a keen ability to identify the smallest changes in people's facial expressions, tones of voice, or body movements. This skill of intuition may have served them well before when attempting to dodge harm or conflict. This ability, though, can also add to miscommunication and misunderstanding. People with high intuition because of experiencing trauma may misread situations that cause them to assume the worst in people and people's intentions, to assume they're not safe, heard, or cared for, or that there are no options to escape a perceived dangerous or unpredictable situation. Intuition can be a key adaptive skill for people recovering from trauma. The next adaptive effect is creativity. People who have experienced trauma often have a fascinating ability to be creative and express a wild imagination. Again, this skill may have served them well as they attempted to dodge conflict or harm. The ability to conjure up a variety of possible bad scenarios that could happen, mixed with even more options on how you could get out of those scenarios, can be helpful when trying to dodge a dangerous situation, whether real or perceived. But having this type of flexible and creative brain means that what for some people might be a passing thought can turn into, for a person with a history of trauma, a full-blown story that may not be true. As the story develops, more and more details come into play until the person has spiraled from a simple, what if, into triggering a panic attack, a flashback, or has spent hours worrying about a situation that does not really exist. Creativity, though, can be a key adaptive skill for a person recovering from trauma. Next, let's talk about trauma memories. The way God has created our brains is amazing. Often people who have experienced a traumatic situation will say, I don't remember a thing about what happened, or the images are so vivid that I can't get them out of my mind. These very different types of reactions are common because our brains are wired to protect us. When the brain detects that something potentially traumatic is occurring, it will do its very best to shut down. That shutdown freezes the traumatic situation in time. Every detail, every smell, every sensation, feeling, color, and texture, every detail of that traumatic moment becomes frozen in time in your memories. These traumatic memories are fixed and static and are stored in our brains and our bodies. For some people, these memories come back randomly throughout the day and are considered intrusive thoughts. For others, these memories are stored in their body, sometimes only remembered explicitly when they are triggered by a smell, sound, or feeling. Unlike traumatic memories that are fixed and static, ordinary memories, both good and bad, are changeable. Over time, how we remember, say, the experience of middle school or our first job, those memories will shift and change. No matter how much time passes, though, traumatic memories will never change. What can change is how often someone thinks about or is triggered by a traumatic memory, and how someone thinks about themselves because of experiencing that traumatic situation. Often trauma survivors believe that there was something more or different they could have done to change what happened. We as faith leaders want to help people express more self-love and more self-understanding. People who have experienced trauma responded in the best way they knew how at the time, and there is no shame or blame for whatever their response was. It is never okay to ask a trauma survivor if they could have done something to prevent the trauma or if they provoked the trauma in some way. Trauma in itself can cause deep wounds. We as faith workers need to be cautious that we don't cause more wounds in our attempts to heal. People affected by trauma may carry visible wounds, but will most certainly carry invisible wounds. As faith leaders, we know that the wounds of Christ never went away. They turned into scars during the process of resurrection from the dead. Likewise, people affected by trauma can experience healing from their trauma story and may arise not with gushing wounds, but with scars of resurrection. We as faith leaders are called to help people in the healing of their wounds, and it is our responsibility to create a space of healing in our congregations and our communities. This healing process involves the whole community and leads into discussing our last adaptive trauma effect, which is isolation. Isolation is a double-edged sword. A direct result of experiencing trauma is likely to be isolation, whether chosen or forced. Helping a trauma survivor reconnect after isolation is not always easy. Their experience with trauma often reorients their beliefs about the world, making daily interactions seem frivolous or dangerous. Some people affected by trauma have used isolation, thinking it is a form of protecting themselves, but it is separating them from a community of healing. Helping people who have experienced trauma to trust again, to risk building healthy relationships, and to fight against isolation is hard work, but it is the work of our churches. Jesus gave us so many examples of healing, and we are called to continue that work. Healing is more than physical healing. We're not just helping to close visible wounds, but also look for and seek to heal the invisible wounds, the wounds of isolation, lack of trust, and hopelessness. We as faith leaders look to heal within and through safe community, to welcome people back into a trusting environment. That means our churches must be ready to be healers, though, to welcome people regardless of their visible and invisible wounds, and must be daring enough to see beyond the isolation, hurt, and fear. We are called to see the individual, the family, and the community who is affected by trauma.